I think we've kind of made the Dark Souls of competitive first-person shooters.
When making a game, you have to take several things into consideration. First, you have to choose a genre. We have plenty of genres to choose from, and some even decide to make their own genre-defying titles like Hello Games with their garbage No Man's Sky. Whether it's a horror sci-fi shooter or something completely new, difficulty is something that you're going to have to take into consideration at some point of development. I've said it plenty of times before and I'll say it again. I love the Soulsborne series, and despite being referenced way too much these days, the Dark Souls series manages to get the difficulty just right, while other developers just straight up ignores any type of research, but still throws the Dark Souls brand around. What makes Dark Souls stand out from every other game that tries to have players get good? I'm not talking about games where you cranked everything up to the most difficult by choice, I'm talking about games that are inherently difficult. Let's try and find out together. I recently got two games, Cuphead and Fall of Light. One game claiming to be heavily inspired by Dark Souls, and the other, Cuphead, a game harder than a block of concrete for no apparent reason. I just want to mention that both Cuphead and Fall of Light are both used as examples, but they're not necessarily bad games. I honestly never bothered finish either of them, so I can't be the judge of whether you should buy them or not. Anyways, I started off with Fall of Light and I thought to myself, this feels more like a prime example of how Dark Souls probably would have looked like if it was made by two people, so maybe it was off to a good start. Then I started dying and the game told me straight to my face, life's not fair. I died, respawned back at the beginning, and the only thing I could think of was nothing. It wasn't clever, it wasn't fair as they so delightfully stated. I didn't even want to play anymore, and I'll get to my reasons why later. Boss fights and enemies in Dark Souls all adhere to a certain pattern. They always follow the same rules, and it's something I've noticed that a lot of games these days are missing. Just that, rules. They're nullified by developers wanting to create dynamic gameplay. When I enter a boss fight in Dark Souls, I know what to expect after having seen the fights a few times. The boss sticks to the same pattern, and the only changes are its certain health values and maybe your range to the boss, but for the most part the fight is consistent in each playthrough. It feels rewarding when you're paying attention to details to find weaknesses in their attacks. Dark Souls gives you room and time to think about your surroundings. Cuphead opts to throw many pattern-based objects at you, making your eventual success feel slightly more luck-based than skill-based for the majority of people. Cuphead had phases, and I started thinking about World of Warcraft and how brilliant they made almost every boss fight. It's probably nostalgia talking for the most part, but getting through each phase one at a time still felt like you were making progress regardless of the outcome. The bosses of Cuphead had 3 to 4, maybe 6 phases, and to me, none of them ever felt rewarding to get through. I'm sure a later level stretches even further in phases, and thus I felt no reason to continue. If I died, I get to see a figure running on a marked line to represent how far I got into the boss fight. Is that supposed to be rewarding or encouraging? Did I get any currency, experience, or fuck all? No. If I wanted coins to buy upgrades, which I so desperately needed, I had to do run and gun missions that killed every sense of dignity I had left by having really cute things kill me over and over again. I'm digressing with World of Warcraft, but Dark Souls had phases too if you break the levels down bonfire by bonfire. It doesn't matter if everything respawns when you use them, you have your safe spot, your progress is safe so far. I kept dying in Cuphead over and over for seemingly no reason or reward whatsoever. Dark Souls rewarded you with an epic boss at the end who itself rewarded you with loot, but you also knew that you've unlocked every shortcut, so running back to the boss after failure, although tedious, didn't slap you in the face by having you start the entire level over. Cuphead also offers plenty of epic boss fights, but with none of the reward. How epic did it really feel when you made it out alive in the end? The reason I snapped after Fall of Light's creative way of ending my life was simple. It never showed me what's on the other side of all that dying I'm about to do. It clearly can't be worth it. Neither did Cuphead or Echo for that matter. Why would you want to be driven to insanity if you're not getting any epics in the process?
Are you not not entertained!
I've seen a handful of videos here on YouTube talk about Dark Souls giving people the strength to break out of their depression. When it comes to Cuphead, I felt like it was about to make me depressed, if anything at best. I went through the same mechanics over and over again until I made it through alive. I had a massive sigh of relief, and then I went off to the next challenge, dreading what's ahead. Graphically speaking, Dark Souls isn't something I can compare to Cuphead, but my point is that Dark Souls made it abundantly obvious that the reward for completion is more content, by simply showing the upcoming areas to the player long before the player ever gets there. In Cuphead, I wondered what the point of it all were and why I should go through the tedious task of defeating every boss. They only made it clear in the first cutscenes, but I don't care about these characters 5 or 20 minutes into the game. Normally games would have their difficulty crank up gradually because invested time is something that we, psychologically speaking, value. There's a reason why some, if not all, surveys have you fill out 5 things first, only to load up 1,000 questions on page 2. You've invested time now, you're The first boss of Dark Souls 3 takes about 4 minutes to get to, and the fight itself is actually quite hard if you don't know what you're doing, even more so if you smash your buttons over and over. But I want to argue 2 things. Dark Souls 3 is Dark Souls 3. You're not Dark Souls 3. You're probably not 3 of anything, and if you're not, I don't see why you would think my 10 or 40 or whatever euros is worth having me die to your incredibly ridiculous sense of difficulty. You're not the 3rd or 2nd installment of a game, whereas I can take your previous game into consideration. Whereas you might get smacked the hell down in Dark Souls 3, you have a hunch of what's ahead because it's the 3rd installment. Second thing, if you do the basics right on the first boss, you're going to make it. There, simple as that, tutorial done in one swoop. It's fucking genius. For some reason, developers who look at Dark Souls for inspiration see all the hype about death and choose to see that as some sort of representation of difficulty. Oh, they died a lot, therefore it must be hard, but that's not the whole story. The only time Dark Souls really punishes you is when you make a mistake, and for the most part, you know you were the one that messed up. Controls are spot on and the attacks all feel precise and different depending on what type of weapon you're using. Different, but not necessarily worse. I might be the shittiest player when it came to Cuphead, but to me it felt like most upgrades I could get acted more as a downgrade to my primary weapon. And I had no reassuring feeling that that would ever change. They made no attempt to try and have me feel like my persistence would ever pay off. Even if that might be the case later in the game, why would I bother if I never stuck around long enough to get that memo? Touched on this subject before, but games, just like movies, is a source of entertainment. Being difficult for the sake of being difficult is something that works sometimes, but it generally isn't entertaining to the player to be slapped over and over, especially when there's no reward involved. So what have we gathered so far? Number 1. Be fair. Dark Souls has a solid core foundation where the rules, although hidden, are strictly adhered to. Very rarely, if ever, can the player blame anyone but themselves when something goes wrong. Number 2. Reward the player. Seriously. Give us an incentive to continue or at least try to get better without having us think about the X amount of money spent as a motivational factor. And last but not least, number 3. Death is not fun. Difficulty, however, is. And the difference here is that I only die if I no longer follow the rules of which number 1 is based upon. Impossible challenges are not really fun unless the game is developed around the idea of death itself. Super Meat Boy is an example of such game. With all that summarized, this to me is why Dark Souls is an incredible game, while at the same time equally difficult. Cuphead felt like a game I wanted to like, and I guess I might be provoked by the fact that I'm not willing to play it, despite being a great game, because it honestly gave me no incentive to do so. Let me know about your experience of difficult games in the comment down below. I'm really curious about what you guys have to say.